Catherine Delahunty.
I'd just like to take a short call as a non-housing expert, because this is not an issue just about housing. It's an issue about our society, our community, our history, and where we're going as a country. And part one is very much about an interesting development in the transfer of powers. So the clauses in part one give two ministers far more direct control over housing than we've seen in the past. And what it reminds me of actually is when the Department of Conservation decision-making around mining was handed over to two ministers, so that instead of just the Minister of Conservation, you then had any other minister in Cabinet, i.e. the Minister of Energy and Minerals, having that decision-making power. So there is a pattern here, and this government's pattern is to transfer power, to centralise power in the hands of the government more and more, and not merely for the fun of it, but to drive through a certain agenda. And the agenda with housing is to privatise the housing stock, because ideologically they believe that we'll all be better off if we're all competing over everything. From the beginning of the day to the dark of the night, it's all got to be the market. Now, in housing, in part one, this is clearly laid out, and what it doesn't do is acknowledge what actually has happened to Housing New Zealand and what the impact will be of handing the power over to the ministers. Now, Housing New Zealand was never the perfect institution, or maybe it was in the 1930s, but for a long time it has been in need of reform. But the kind of reform that's being introduced here is a disturbing ideological breakup of community. I'll say, it's all described in two words: Glen Innes, and with the police dragging people out of their houses, they broke a community because of a plan that is being driven by ministers rather than driven by communities, let alone the meat in the sandwich, which is Housing New Zealand. Now, I was an advocate for people in the Tairāwhiti dealing with housing under the previous government, and it wasn't perfect. There were long lists then. There was overcrowding then. But what we have now is a proposal to so-called reform this in a way that will prevent the very desperate and the very needy to have access to housing. And all the rhetoric about social housing is not what social housing groups mean. It's what the government means. And this bill is particularly disturbing because in part one, it entrenches the idea that the government understands what social housing is. They don't, they didn't, and they won't, because they think it's about making a profit out of people who need homes. And that is not what social housing is about. It is not about the market. It is about meeting an incredibly important need. As someone who's lived in a time in my life when I needed social housing, I really appreciated the state house I lived in. It's long gone. Wellington Street, Ponsonby, or Freeman's Bay, actually, all gone. All of that housing that actually, as I think a previous speaker described it as a mixed community, it was a diverse and mixed community. But those communities are not on the agenda with this change to the Act and to Housing New Zealand. Now, the regulatory impact statement says that more fundamentally, this option changes the relationship between the Crown and Housing New Zealand from one at arm's length to one where the Crown has direct control over the housing stock. And as a former advocate for people who needed housing, I have to be very afraid, because it will be based on efficiency. It will be based on words like what is the most efficient way to manage these units, i.e. human beings, and whether they will get the kind of housing they need or not at an affordable rent will not be the main priority. They claim, the regulatory impact statement also says that ring fencing and limiting ministers' mandate will mitigate the impact of the provisions on Housing New Zealand and provide greater transparency of ministers' actions. I find that a little difficult to believe. That's not our experience of ministers having more power, that therefore suddenly there's more transparency, that the public and the people in need of housing will get more out of that model. Housing New Zealand was created by our money for the public good. Public service may not be real to this government, but it's real to the rest of us. The public good and public housing for people who need it is a core value of a society that has changed a great deal. And we would love to see in the Greens Housing New Zealand reformed to a genuine progressive public servant who actually knew how to listen and work with, not for people who have the ability to develop sites, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable Dr. Nixon.
Mr. Chairman, I'm very happy